Welcome. Today we are going to be looking at RESTful API testing. We're going to be looking at using tools such as RestAssured, Karate. We'll be discussing things like Swagger, Postman, and generally just talking about web services in general and how we go about testing them. So the overview of this particular course, this is going to be a three-part presentation. We're going to focus on RESTful APIs, RestAssured, Karate, the API testing tool, not the actual physical act. And we're going to look at a simple project using both. So we'll kind of do a side-by-side comparison between the different libraries that are out there that we're going to test with. So let's start by talking about what is RESTful API. And before I go over this, let's first go over that API is an application programming interface that is a set of rules that defines how the application or device can connect to and communicate with each other. So when we talk about REST APIs, we're talking about providing a flexible, lightweight way to integrate our applications and have emerged as the most common method for connecting components in a microservice architecture. Now, this definition comes from IBM, but typically if you search REST APIs or RESTful API, you come up with some type of definition similar to this. And it's essentially a way to communicate between different applications across the web. So it's just a kind of a template way for us to integrate our applications, be it mobile, be it web, backend databases to web servers. In our presentation today, we're primarily going to focus on these four HTTP methods. Now, there are others, and we'll look at Mozilla briefly to go over the full list, but the ones we're going to focus on are get, post, put, and delete. Get is probably the most common HTTP method, and it is used to request a representation of a specified resource. So this is kind of like where we get data or fetch data from a web service. It could be a list, it could be a record. Post is typically used for submitting an entity to be a specified resource. This is where we actually have kind of like web forms where we push a bunch of information up to the web service, to the application. We can also use put, where we actually replace the current representations of the target resource with a different payload. And finally, we can use delete to remove a resource from the remote machine. So today we're going to focus primarily on RestAssured and looking at our test application that we're going to integrate with. So RestAssured is a Java DSL, and DSL stands for Domain-Specific Language. And it's used for simplifying tests of a REST-based service built on top of an HTTP builder. Now, RestAssured supports post, get, put, delete, option, patch, and head. Now, there are other types of requests that we can use, but these are typically the ones that are generally used to validate and verify the response of the requests. Next, we have Karate. And Karate is another domain-specific language. And Karate is an open source tool to combine API test automation, mocks, performance testing, and UI automation into a single unified framework. One of the things about Karate is that it is built on the BDD syntax of Cucumber. So it is a Gherkins-like framework. And what's nice about it is it does have a Java hook where you can actually use Java to expand upon your Karate test. It doesn't necessarily need Java. It can use JavaScript and become a kind of an open standard for even non-programmers. And we'll look at that a little bit throughout this course. Finally, at the end of this series, we will talk about how Karate and RestAssured kind of compare with one another, how they match up, how they stack up. So throughout this entire presentation, we're going to primarily be doing a demo. And this demo is going to be comprised of an application. So here is a simple overview of what it is we're going to be looking at. So we have a company that wants to set up a tutorial center on a university to help students study. They have started building a web service application that records the subjects that will be covered. Currently, the interface supports things like post, get, delete, and put. And we're going to define some tests that test that implementation. So we'll have things like creating a tutorial, retrieving all the tutorials in the system, retrieve a tutorial by ID, update a tutorial by ID, find all published tutorials, find a title containing a string. We want to delete a specific tutorial, and then we want to delete all the tutorials. We'll walk through how to do it through Postman. We'll use Swagger. We'll look at using RestAssured, and we'll also look at doing this with Karate. So let's get started. So to start with, let's go out to the Mozilla site that I referenced in the notes. So here we see all the different types of HTTP request methods that are available to us from the web. So we have things like get, head, post, put, delete, connect, options, trace, and patch, and a brief definition of each. Next, I provided in Slack the link to RestAssured. So RestAssured lives out on github.com/rest-assured/rest-assured. Now here on the main page, you have a README, which gives you the basic overviews of what you can do with the language. And we'll go over this in a little more detail later. I also provide a link to the Karate Labs/Karate on GitHub, and a link from the Karate that kind of gives a comparison between the two. Now, the Karate and the comparison we'll cover over the next two lessons, but I just wanted to provide them now if you want to kind of read ahead before we get to those. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we have to have some type of web service application. So as we talked about in our slides, we have a test application already built. So I have this demo application here that is a Spring Boot application with some additional components added. So let's look at the POM file. So it's also a Maven project. So I typically use Maven for all of my web applications because it's so easy to integrate with third-party libraries. So here in our POM file, we have a list of some dependencies. Now, because I'm using Spring STS and I'm using the Spring framework, I can just outright import the Spring libraries that are already provided within the Spring tool suite. So that gives us access to our Spring Boot Starter, JPA. I'm doing a kind of web-driven database here. So we're going to load things into memory. We're using H2 database, and I'm using Spring Boot Starter Web. And by doing this, I have access to the library. So we can use Spring Boot. I also included a parent to the Spring Boot library artifact, which allows me to import and set the Spring Boot starter parent to 2.6.3. By doing this, I do not have to specify the versions down here. It will automatically pull in the dependencies from this library that I want to use. All right, in order to use RestAssured, we have to include these libraries here. So we start with the basics, IO RestAssured, and we need the RestAssured artifact. If we want to use JSON, we need to include the JSON path artifact. If you want XML, you want to use the XML path. And finally, if you want to do some JSON scheme validations, you need to include the JSON schema validator. So these four dependencies pretty much wrap up everything that you need for RestAssured. Now, if we want to include in our project Swagger, we also need to include Spring Docs. Prior to using Spring Docs, you would have to include the Spring Fox Swagger components, but Spring has now simplified this into Spring Docs. So for Swagger, we need to use Spring Docs. All right, so that's our POM file. So these are our dependencies. So now if we go look at the project itself, we have our source main Java or our source test Java. We also have a source main resources folder. Now, because this is a Spring Boot application, we need to put some of our configuration settings in the application properties. Since I have a database, I need to configure my H2 so that I can enable the H2 in-memory database, and I give it a console path so I can access this if I want to access it from a database tool. I also need to set my data source, my class name, user, and password. Since we're also going to use JPA to tie into our database with our entities, so we're going to use JPA show, JPA properties, hibernate dialect, and hibernate DLL auto. By doing this, this will show our SQL in the console down here when we actually run or start up Spring Boot. And finally, to configure Swagger, all we had to do is add these two property lines. We had to set the spring.swagger UI path, which is going to be API docs, and we had to do spring.docs.swagger operation sorter. So how are we going to sort our methods? And because I did this, it's going to sort them alphabetically. The project itself is fairly straightforward. We have our demo application. So this is our Spring application. So if you're doing Spring Boot, you just have to have a Spring Boot class with main that essentially starts the Spring application. And that will be what's down here, our little Spring Boot. It essentially starts a Tomcat web service for us. Our configuration file here, I'm preloading some data within our database. So I just have a command line bean that will add 2 tutorial records to our database in memory every time we restart. I find this is useful for testing because it gives us a starting point. Our web service itself is composed of a controller, and we have these methods here. We have get all tutorials, get tutorials by ID, create tutorials, update, delete all, and find by published IDs. Just have some basic logic in here. The interesting one is the get. We use our annotations for our different HTTP requests. So we have get, we have post, we have put, and delete. Now this looks ugly, and from a tester's perspective, we really don't need to get into this level, but I'm just kind of walking through how the project's set up. Then we have our model, which contains tutorial, and this is just our entity bean. So we define it as entity, we set our table name to tutorials in memory, and we give it an ID, our title, our description, and our Boolean for published. And this is just a regular POJO. So we have all of our getters and setters. And then finally, we set up the repository. And we define the repository to give it some additional lookup. So we have that find by published, which returns a list. And we have find by titles containing, which also returns a list. So we can look up by the published Boolean, or we could look up by title. Otherwise, we use the straight up getters and setters within our lookups. So what's interesting here, so if we do extends JPA, this gives us that full kind of CRUD functionality that we'll see in our API with the addition of these two lookups. So we talked about resources. So now let's go down and let's look at what we have in our test. So for this particular example, since RestAssured is a Java library for testing APIs, I thought it'd be easier to just drop it right into our Spring Boot project here, because it also gives me the ability to reuse our tutorial application, or our tutorial entity bean. So here we have just a typical Spring Boot test, which is essentially JUnit, but it's going to kick off a Spring Boot instance to run our JUnit tests. So we can actually deploy this test suite as a separate microservice and run it on a different system. So you can have your API running on one and then kick off your tests on another. We also want to add test method order. This way we can actually tell it the order that we want to run our tests in. And then we give it the name. Now, in our slides, we basically stated that we want to test these 8 different components. We want to create a tutorial test, retrieve all tutorials, retrieve a tutorial by ID, update, find, and delete. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a test. So let's come in here. So in Java, if you're using JUnit, or TestNG or most test frameworks, you have a test annotation. So we start with test. Now, because I want to run these in a specific order, I also can include the order annotation. And for that, it requires a number, essentially a sequential number. So we'll do 1. Now, since we want our first test to be create a tutorial, we'll come down in here and we'll do void create a tutorial, and let's make it camel case to comply with Java naming conventions. So right now we have now added an empty test to create a tutorial lookup. Now, before we actually continue writing this out, let's take a moment and actually start the API, look at the console, and then look at the API structure from Swagger. So let me restart Spring Boot. Spring starts up Tomcat. We initialize our H2 console for H2 UI for our database lookup. We run our configuration. So we build our table. We build the create sequence hibernate. And then we call and we insert our tutorials. So we've preloaded the tutorials with calculus and how to introduce testing into the development cycle. We have our unique IDs and we have our published Boolean flag. So the calculus is published, my book is not. So we have our description and we're not published. So now that it's started, if we actually go out and look at our browser, we can go to localhost, whatever port we're running on. Right now we're using the default. If I put in swagger-ui/index.html, I get my API for my tutorial. So our demo application has these API calls.